Everyone laughed when the war veteran bought a ruined school for pennies. Nobody believed anything good could come of it. But what he discovered inside turned his life upside down and silenced all his critics. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The rain had fallen through the night, leaving the streets of the town glistening with shallow puddles that reflected the pale light of the rising sun. Alexander sat by his window in a small rented room, his hands folded on the chipped wooden table before him. The radiator in the corner hissed but gave no real warmth, and the smell of damp plaster clung to the air. He had grown accustomed to this atmosphere over the years, to the quiet decay of his surroundings that mirrored the fatigue of his own life. Once, long ago, he had imagined himself living differently, surrounded by family, by laughter, by purpose. War had taken that away from him, and what the bullets and shrapnel had not claimed, time and disappointment had finished. His legs, stiff and half useless, ached in the morning chill. He had learned to walk with a cane, though every step reminded him of what had been lost. The neighbors saw him as a broken man, a soldier once respected, now reduced to silence and shadows. He felt their eyes on him when he moved along the street, some offering pity, others disdain, most avoiding him altogether. He had learned to ignore them, though the weight of being invisible pressed down on him harder than any wound. It was one morning, while idly leafing through a stack of old newspapers left in the lobby of his building, that he saw the small advertisement. It was nothing extraordinary. One line buried among the notices of livestock sales, second-hand farm tools, and cheap properties. For sale, abandoned rural schoolhouse. Inquire at town office. He read it twice, then a third time, before folding the paper carefully and sliding it into his coat pocket. He could not explain why the words clung to him. Perhaps it was the thought of space, of walls that were his alone. Perhaps it was simply curiosity. Or perhaps, deeper still, it was the idea that he could occupy himself with something more than the endless repetition of empty days. When he told the clerk at the town office that he wanted to see the papers, the man nearly laughed. "That ruin?" the clerk said with a smirk. "You'd be better off buying a cow. At least that could give you milk. The school has been rotting for decades. Nobody wanted it. Why would you?" Alexander did not bother to answer. He signed the papers, his hands steady, his face calm, though inside he felt something stir. The clerk shrugged and muttered under his breath as he handed over the documents. The signature was done, and the keys, rusted, cold, and heavy, were dropped onto the table between them. The sound echoed like the closing of a door behind him. The news traveled quickly, as news always did in places where little ever happened. By the next morning, when he walked to the cafe at the corner, whispers followed him like shadows. A few men chuckled openly. "The cripple bought himself a palace," one said. "I bet it collapses on him before he even finds the chalkboard." Another snickered, loud enough for Alexander to hear. He kept his eyes forward, his face still, but every word burned. He had been laughed at before, dismissed before, and he thought the sting of it had dulled with time. Yet there was something about this particular laughter, about the scorn in their voices, that awakened a stubbornness he had not felt in years. The following day, he packed what little he owned into the back of his battered car. A few blankets, a pot, a small collection of tools. In the cane that leaned against the passenger seat, he looked around his room one last time, at the cracked paint on the walls and the curtains sagging from its rod, and felt nothing but relief. The drive out of town was slow, the road slick from the rain. He kept the folded deed to the school on the seat beside him, the paper heavy with possibility. As the city fell away behind him, the roads narrowed into country lanes bordered by fields gone wild. Old barns leaned into the earth, their roofs sagging under years of neglect. It was as though he was traveling backward in time, leaving the present behind and stepping into a world long forgotten. The sky hung low with gray clouds, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. His car rattled over the uneven road, every bump a reminder of its age, but still it carried him onward. At last he reached the small village where the school stood. It was perched on the edge of the settlement, a hulking silhouette against the trees. The building loomed in the distance, its roofline broken where sections had collapsed, its walls streaked with vines and moss. The iron gate that once welcomed children now hung crooked, rust eating through its bars. He parked at the edge of the overgrown yard and stepped out, leaning heavily on his cane. For a long moment he simply stood there, staring. The schoolyard was wild, swallowed by weeds and thorns. A rusted swing creaked faintly in the wind, its chains groaning as though carrying the weight of invisible children. The soccer field was no more than a patch of uneven ground, its goalposts bent and half buried in the soil. Windows gaped like hollow eyes, glass long gone, frames warped by years of rain and frost. The doors sagged on their hinges as though reluctant to welcome anyone inside again. And yet, beneath the ruin, there was something else. Something in the way the walls still stood firm, in the way the bricks refused to crumble completely. The school was broken, yes, but not defeated. Alexander felt a strange kinship with it. He understood what it was to be abandoned, to be dismissed as useless, to be left standing when all else had moved on. He made his way slowly across the yard, gravel crunching under his boots, weeds brushing against his legs. The cane sank into the damp earth with each step. When he reached the front steps, he paused, staring up at the facade that towered above him. A faded sign still clung to the wall. The name of the school, letters chipped but legible. He touched it with his hand, tracing the grooves worn by time. The key fit into the lock with surprising ease, though the door resisted when he pushed. It groaned, hinges stiff from disuse, before yielding. A wave of stale air rolled out, thick with dust and the faint metallic tang of rust. He stepped inside. The hallway stretched before him, lined with doors that led to classrooms. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight. Cobwebs draped the corners, and dust motes floated in the dim light that filtered through broken windows. A grand portrait of a stern-faced man, perhaps a former headmaster, hung crooked on the wall. His gaze sharp even through the grime that coated the canvas. Alexander moved slowly through the space, his cane tapping softly against the floor. The silence was overwhelming, so complete that each sound he made echoed through the corridors. It felt as though the building itself were holding its breath, waiting. He stepped into one of the classrooms. Rows of desks stood neatly in place, their surfaces carved with the names and doodles of long-vanished students. The blackboard bore the faint outline of chalk words, half erased but still visible, a lesson frozen in time. On the teacher's desk lay a stack of papers, brittle and yellowed, untouched for decades. A child's drawing of a house, crudely done in colored pencil, was pinned to the wall. He stared at it for a long time, his throat tight. In that moment, he felt something stir deep within him. He had come here expecting nothing more than ruin, a place to waste away his days with work that did not matter. Instead, he felt as though he had stepped into a memory, into the remnants of lives that had once been full of laughter and learning. The walls held stories, and though time had tried to bury them, they remained, waiting to be uncovered. Alexander drew in a long breath, tasting the dust and decay, and felt a flicker of something he had not known in years' purpose. The school was his now, for better or worse. The villagers might laugh, the clerk might sneer, but it was no longer their concern. He had made a choice, and the building that stood before him, broken yet enduring, would shape what came next. As he left the classroom and returned to the hallway, the weight of silence pressed down on him again, but this time it did not feel suffocating. It felt expectant. He glanced back once at the open door, at the rows of desks bathed in the dim light, and then stepped further into the shadows of the school. The journey had only begun, and though he could not yet see where it would lead, he felt the pull of something greater than himself. The veteran and the school, both broken, both forgotten, had found each other. And in that unlikely meeting, something new was beginning to stir. The silence of the school lingered with him long after he closed the door of that first classroom. Alexander stood in the dim hallway, leaning on his cane, listening to the faint groan of the walls as if the building were settling itself after being disturbed. The air was heavy, stale with dust, and yet beneath it lay a faint sweetness of rotting wood and damp plaster, the scent of years left unattended. He moved slowly forward, each step measured, his cane tapping lightly on the warped floorboards, his breath loud in the echoing stillness. It was as though every corner of the place were watching him, waiting to see what he would do next. The corridor stretched on with doors leading into other classrooms. Some hung open, others sagged on broken hinges. The glass panes that once shone clear had long since shattered, leaving jagged teeth in the frames. Patches of plaster had fallen away to expose the laths beneath, and here and there vines had crept in through cracks, their tendrils curling across the walls as though nature itself had claimed the space. Alexander stopped at one door and pushed it open with his shoulder. It swung inward with a sigh. The room beyond looked almost untouched by time, as though the children had only just risen from their seats. Desks sat in neat rows, though a few had collapsed where the wood had rotted through. On the walls, faded posters still clung. Their colors bled pale. Arithmetic tables, maps of the world, patriotic slogans urging diligence and loyalty. The blackboard bore faint white ghosts of chalk words, lessons abandoned mid-sentence, as though the teacher had stepped away, intending to return. He walked between the desks, running his hand over their surfaces. The wood was scratched with names, initials, crude drawings of hearts, stars, and even tiny soldiers. It was a record of childhood carved into the grain, stubborn and enduring. He lowered himself into one of the chairs, the wood groaning under his weight, and for a moment closed his eyes. He tried to imagine the sound that must once have filled this room, the chatter of voices, the scrape of chairs, the stern command of the teacher's voice. He could almost hear the echoes, but when he opened his eyes, the silence was heavier than before, pressing against his chest until he forced himself to stand. The atmosphere of the room was not simply empty, it was charged as though it remembered more than it wished to reveal. The next classroom was worse. The ceiling had partially collapsed, scattering plaster across the floor in a white heap. Rain had found its way through the broken roof, and the smell of mold was strong. He stepped carefully around the rubble, his cane sinking slightly into the damp patches. Here, too, desks remained, though many were overturned. Against the far wall stood a row of small lockers, their doors ajar, some hanging off hinges. He pulled one open and found nothing but dust. Another revealed a child's satchel, leather stiff and cracked. Inside were a few books swollen by moisture, their pages stuck together. One had been a reader, its illustrations of animals and fables blurred beyond recognition. He carried the satchel back to the center of the room and set it on a desk. There was something intimate about it, something deeply human in the sight of a child's forgotten belongings. He turned the bag over and found initials scratched into the strap. They were too faint to read clearly, but they reminded him that someone, a real child, had carried this every day, had sat in these rooms, had written on these pages. The thought pressed on him with a weight heavier than the cane he leaned upon. Moving deeper into the building, he discovered the assembly hall. The double doors had swollen shut, but after pushing with all his weight, they yielded suddenly, sending him stumbling forward. The hall stretched wide, its ceiling high, though broken windows near the top let in streaks of gray light. Rows of chairs sat in ordered lines before a stage, dust coating them in thick layers. The stage itself bore the remnants of a curtain, its fabric tattered, sagging like the skin of something long dead. He stood there for a long while, gazing at the rows of empty seats. He imagined them filled with children, with parents gathered for plays, with laughter and applause echoing to the rafters. Now there was only silence, heavy and suffocating. It was in this hall that he first felt the chill. Not the cold of the air, though it was damp and raw, but something deeper, something that stirred his skin and set the hairs rising on the back of his neck. He turned slowly, his eyes moving over the rows of seats, convinced for a moment that he would see someone there. But the hall was empty, nothing but shadows and dust. Still, the sensation lingered. He left quickly, his breath unsteady, telling himself it was only the damp in his imagination. The further he went, the more the strangeness of the school pressed in upon him. The library was a ruin, shelves sagging under the weight of books, swollen by years of moisture. When he pulled one free, it disintegrated in his hands, the pages falling away in yellow flakes that scattered across his coat. He brushed them off with a grimace, but as he did, his eye caught on the wall behind the shelves. There, faint but deliberate, were markings, lines carved into the wood, intersecting shapes that seemed too careful to be accidents. He leaned closer, tracing them with his fingers. Circles, triangles, arrows pointing inward. He frowned. They looked almost like symbols, though their meaning escaped him. His pulse quickened, though he could not have said why. There was a purpose behind these carvings, a message left by hands long gone. The discovery unsettled him. He closed the door to the library behind him and moved on, but the image of those symbols remained, etched not only into the wood, but into his mind. By late afternoon, the light had shifted, turning the windows into dull mirrors. The school seemed to darken with the sky, as though reluctant to surrender itself to night. Alexander found himself in what must once have been the dining hall. Long tables stretched across the floor, their surfaces thick with grime. Chairs still stood neatly around them, arranged as if awaiting a meal that had never come. On one table lay silverware, tarnished but intact, spoons and forks set precisely beside plates. The sight was uncanny. It was as though time had stopped abruptly, freezing the moment forever. He shivered and left the room quickly. He wandered until fatigue overcame him. His leg ached fiercely, and the effort of moving across uneven floors drained what little strength he had. He returned to the first classroom he had entered and laid his blanket across a couch he had dragged from the corner. He brushed away the worst of the dust and lowered himself onto it. The silence deepened as night fell. Every creak of the building amplified, every sigh of wind through broken shutters like a whisper at the edge of hearing. He lay awake for hours, his eyes fixed on the dark ceiling above. At times he thought he heard footsteps in the hall, slow and deliberate, though he knew it could only be the house settling. Still, the sound chilled him. Sleep came reluctantly, broken and restless. He dreamed of corridors stretching endlessly, of doors opening onto blackness, of children's voices calling from the shadows. When he woke with a start, his heart hammering, the air felt colder than before. The chandelier above swayed slightly, though there was no draft. He told himself it was nothing, only his weary mind playing tricks. Yet as he lay back down, he could not shake the sense that the building was watching him, listening to his every breath. When the morning light finally crept through the cracked windows, it revealed dust motes drifting in the air like pale specters. Alexander sat up slowly, his back aching, his throat dry. He looked around the room with clearer eyes, and the thought struck him with unsettling force. The school was not merely abandoned. It was waiting. Every desk, every chalkboard, every silent hallway seemed a whisper of something unfinished, of stories that had not been allowed to end. He could feel it pressing in on him, not hostile, not welcoming, but insistent. For the first time in many years, he felt a spark of something more than survival. Curiosity, fragile but undeniable, stirred within him. The school was more than wood and stone. It carried voices, memories, secrets, and he was now part of them. He leaned heavily on his cane, rising to his feet, and stared down the shadowed hallway that stretched before him. The villagers might have laughed, the clerk might have smirked, but he understood now that this place was no ruin. It was a story left unfinished, waiting for someone to listen. He tightened his grip on the cane, his heart beating faster than it had in years, and stepped forward into the silence. The first day in the school had unsettled him. The second would draw him deeper. And somewhere in its walls, hidden beneath dust and shadows, waited the truths that time had tried to bury. The second day in the school began with a restless heaviness that had clung to Alexander through the night. He had slept little, roused too often by sounds that might have been no more than the groaning of wood and stone, but which, in his fatigue, had taken on a shape of their own. He woke with his blanket damp from the clammy air, and his throat dry from breathing dust. The pale morning light seeped through broken windows, illuminating the room in uneven shafts that caught the drifting motes and turned them into tiny glowing embers. For a long moment he sat still, his cane leaning against the couch, and let the silence settle around him. It was not the quiet of peace, but of suspension, as though the school itself waited to see what he would do next. He rose slowly, wincing at the ache in his leg, and made his way into the hallway. The cane tapped softly on the warped floorboards as he moved, each sound swallowed by the vast emptiness of the building. He retraced his steps from the day before, revisiting the classrooms where desks stood in solemn rows, the assembly hall with its tattered curtain, the dining hall where tables still bore tarnished silverware. Each space seemed even stranger in the daylight, less like ruin and more like a stage abandoned mid-performance. He paused in the library once more, gazing at the sagging shelves and the strange markings he had uncovered on the wall. The shapes were still there, carved into the wood with careful precision, but his mind offered no answers. He moved on, telling himself that clarity might come later. It was in one of the smaller classrooms, tucked at the far end of the corridor, that he made the discovery that would change the way he looked at the school forever. The door was stiff, swollen by years of damp, and he had to push hard to open it. Inside, the room was darker than the others, its windows narrow and partially boarded. Dust lay heavy across the floor, and in the corner stood a cabinet, its surface cracked and warped. Alexander approached it cautiously, his cane scraping the boards as he moved. The cabinet's doors resisted at first, but with a grunt of effort, he managed to pry them open. Inside lay a stack of old exercise books, their covers faded, their edges curled and brittle. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the top one, brushing away a layer of dust. It was a child's notebook, the kind used for lessons, its cover adorned with a simple pattern that had long since dulled. He opened it carefully, the pages fragile under his fingers. At first the writing was cheerful, the letters large and uneven, a child's hand learning to form words. "Today we played in the yard," one entry read. "Teacher said we must be quick to learn." The sentences were simple, innocent, filled with the ordinary details of school life. He turned the pages, reading quietly in the silent room. "Mother baked bread," another page said. "I miss Father. He is away." He paused, his throat tightening. The handwriting grew steadier as the entries continued, but the words darkened. "There are soldiers near the village," one line read. "We are told to stay inside." Another entry. "There is little food. My brother cries at night." He turned page after page, the story unfolding in fragments. Each sentence a glimpse into a child's world during a time of fear. The final entry stopped abruptly, the last words scrawled hastily. "If tomorrow," and then nothing. The page after was blank. He closed the book slowly, his hands trembling, and pressed it to his chest. The weight of it was unbearable, yet he could not put it down. He reached for another notebook from the stack. This one bore a different handwriting, smaller, more precise. The early entries spoke of lessons, of friends, of childish dreams of becoming a teacher or a doctor. But as he turned the pages, the shadows deepened again. "They say the school is safe," one entry read. "We are to stay here." Another, "Mother left me here with my sister. She kissed me and said she would come back soon." The entries grew fewer, the handwriting more hurried. The last page bore only a single line. "We must be quiet tonight." Alexander set the notebook down with care, his vision blurred. He felt as though he had stumbled into a chorus of voices that had been waiting all these years for someone to listen. Each book was a life interrupted, each page a fragment of a story that had never found its end. He took another and another, reading until the words blurred together. Some contained little more than lessons, but even there were glimpses of the outside world pressing in. Mentions of sirens, of hiding, of whispers that they might be taken away. When at last he leaned back, the pile of notebooks before him, he felt hollowed out. His heart ached with a pain he thought he had long since buried, the pain of loss and of being left behind. He remembered his own war, the faces of comrades who never returned, the nights filled with hunger and fear. He had thought his suffering unique, but here in his hands were the voices of children who had known the same fear, the same silence. Their words bridged the years between them, binding his wounds to theirs. He remained in the classroom for hours, the daylight shifting across the floor as he read. Sometimes he would pause and stare at the walls, trying to imagine the children who had once sat at these desks, their laughter echoing in the space that now held only dust. He imagined them bent over their notebooks, writing with small, determined hands, unaware that their words would become the only trace of them left behind. As evening approached, he gathered the notebooks into a careful pile and set them on the teacher's desk. He sat before them, his cane leaning against the chair, and let the silence wrap around him. The air seemed charged, heavy with memory. He thought he heard faint whispers, though when he strained to listen, there was nothing. Still, the feeling lingered, that the school itself was speaking through these pages, that the voices of the children had waited for him alone. When at last he left the room, closing the door softly behind him, he carried more than notebooks. He carried the weight of their unfinished stories, the echo of their small voices calling across time. He knew then that his journey into this place was not merely about occupying his days with work. It was about listening, about uncovering what had been hidden and silenced. The school had given him its first secret, and in doing so had bound him to it. As he returned to the couch he had claimed for himself, laying out his blanket in the growing dusk, the memory of those words burned in his mind. "We must be quiet tonight." He closed his eyes, but sleep would not come easily. The voices of the children lingered, whispering through the darkness, urging him to look deeper. And he understood with a certainty that tightened his chest that the school had much more to reveal. The night after Alexander discovered the diaries was longer than any he had endured since the war. He lay awake on the couch in the dim room, the pile of notebooks stacked carefully on the teacher's desk, as though they were sacred relics. Every time he closed his eyes, words from the children returned to him, lines etched in his mind as though he himself had written them. "We must be quiet tonight, if tomorrow." Those unfinished thoughts pressed into him with a weight heavier than the damp air around him. He drifted into sleep only to wake again moments later, his body stiff, his heart quickened by dreams he could not clearly remember. When morning finally came, pale and reluctant, he rose with the sense that the school was urging him forward. He returned to the classrooms where the diaries had been hidden, tracing his fingers along the cracked plaster and warped floorboards. The voices he had read were not merely words now. They seemed to hover in the very air, whispering through the silence, asking him to look deeper. The school was no longer just a ruin. It was a vessel filled with secrets, and if those notebooks were the surface of what had been left behind, then somewhere within its walls lay the deeper truths. The idea of the basement came to him almost naturally, as though guided. He had avoided it the first days, deterred by the heavy door at the end of the hall that led downward into darkness. Now, with the diary still burning in his memory, he felt compelled to open it. The key turned reluctantly, the lock grinding with age, and the hinges groaned as he pushed the door wide. A rush of cold air spilled out, damp and sour, carrying with it the smell of mildew and stone. The staircase was narrow, its steps worn and slick with moisture. He gripped the railing with one hand and his cane with the other, descending slowly, each movement deliberate. The deeper he went, the more the air thickened, until it felt as though he were sinking into another world altogether. At the bottom, the weak light from the hallway above faded into gloom. He lit the lantern he had brought, its glow casting trembling shadows across the walls. The basement was low and narrow, its walls built of rough stone. Pipes lined the ceiling, dripping occasionally into shallow puddles on the floor. Wooden crates stood stacked against one wall, their surfaces blackened with age. He pried one open with the iron tip of his cane and found it filled with rotted papers, crumbling to dust at his touch. Another held rusted tools long since useless. But it was not the crates that drew his attention. At the far end of the basement stood a wall that did not match the rest. The stones were smoother, the mortar newer, as though built later than the others. When he tapped it with the tip of his cane, the sound rang hollow. His pulse quickened. He leaned closer, brushing away the grime, and saw faint scratches across the surface. They were not random. They were markings, deliberate lines like those he had found in the library, carved into the wood behind the shelves. Circles intersected with triangles, arrows pointing inward, the same symbols, repeating here. The thought that there was something hidden behind the wall tightened his chest. His first instinct was hesitation. He was alone, a broken man with no strength to waste on foolish efforts. But another voice rose within him, stubborn and insistent, the same that had pushed him to buy this ruin when everyone else had laughed. The children's words returned to him. "We are to stay here. We must be quiet tonight." He knew without knowing how that this wall was part of their story, and if he turned away, their voices would remain unheard forever. He set the lantern down and searched the room for anything that might help. In the corner, he found an old crowbar, its metal rusted but still solid. He wedged it into a crack between the stones and pulled with all the strength his arms would allow. At first, nothing happened. The wall resisted, as though it too had been waiting all these years to keep its secret sealed. He gritted his teeth, sweat beading on his brow, and pulled harder. A stone shifted, scraping against the one beside it, and then another. Dust rained down, stinging his eyes and filling the air with a bitter taste. Slowly, painfully, he worked at the wall until a hole opened wide enough to let air seep through. The draft that spilled out was colder than the basement itself, carrying with it the smell of earth and old wood. His heart pounded as he widened the gap, stone by stone, until at last an opening appeared. He held the lantern high and peered through. Beyond lay darkness, thick and unbroken, but unmistakably a space where none should be. He pulled himself through the narrow gap, his shoulders scraping the stone. Inside was a small chamber, its walls close, the ceiling low enough that he had to stoop. Dust lay thick across the floor, undisturbed for decades. Against one wall stood a row of shelves. Upon them were objects that made his breath catch. Small toys, a wooden doll missing an arm, a ball deflated but still intact, a stack of books bound with twine. He stepped closer, his lantern trembling in his hand. These were not forgotten supplies. They were belongings, carefully placed. On a table in the center of the room lay a collection of notebooks, smaller and thinner than the ones he had found upstairs. He opened one, and his heart tightened. The handwriting was that of a child, uneven and hurried. "They told us we must stay here," the words read. "We sleep in the basement now. It is dark and cold." Another line, "Teacher says to be quiet. The soldiers are near." The pages were filled with fragments, each entry echoing the voices of children who had hidden here, waiting, frightened. Alexander sank onto a stool, the weight of it pressing him down. He turned page after page, each one more painful than the last. Some spoke of hunger, of the sound of boots overhead, of the hope that their parents would return. Others were little more than drawings, stick figures huddled beneath crude outlines of walls, wide-eyed faces staring upward. The last page bore no words at all, only a smudge of ink, as though the pen had been pulled away too suddenly. He closed the notebook with trembling hands and looked around the room again. In the corner lay a small pile of clothing, neatly folded though eaten by moss. A pair of tiny shoes sat atop it, their leather still polished as though waiting for the child who would never return. His vision blurred, and he reached out to touch them, his fingers brushing the cold surface. A shiver ran through him, not from the chill, but from the sense that he was touching memory itself. The air in the chamber seemed thicker, heavier with each breath. He felt as though he were not alone, as though the walls themselves remembered the children who had once crowded here, whispering in the dark. For a long time he sat in silence, the lantern casting flickering light across the shelves and the small relics of lost lives. He thought of his own comrades, of nights spent in bunkers listening to the distant thunder of artillery, of the fear that clawed at the edges of his mind. The children had known that same fear, perhaps even worse, trapped without understanding why. At last he rose, his legs trembling, and made his way back to the opening. The hole in the wall seemed darker now, the passage back into the basement less certain. He squeezed through, dragging the lantern with him, and stood once more in the familiar damp. Behind him the chamber waited, sealed in shadows, holding its secrets even as it had offered them. He braced himself against the wall, his chest heaving. He had uncovered the truth. The school had not simply been abandoned. It had been a refuge, a place where children had hidden from the storm of war. And yet something had silenced them, leaving only their notebooks and toys behind. As he climbed the stairs back toward the light of the upper floor, the weight of what he had seen pressed down on him. He reached the hallway and leaned heavily on his cane, staring at the cracked tiles and the dust that coated everything. The laughter of the villagers who had mocked him seemed distant now, irrelevant. What he carried within him was far greater than their scorn. He was no longer merely a man occupying an old ruin. He was a witness to voices that had been silenced too soon. That night, as he lay once more on the couch with the diary spread before him, the silence of the school seemed different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with whispers, with memories, with the presence of those who had once filled its halls. He closed his eyes and felt them around him. Not hostile, not welcoming, but waiting. Waiting for him to uncover the rest of their story. Waiting for him to give them back the voices they had been denied. And Alexander understood, with a certainty as deep as the ache in his bones, that his journey into the heart of the school had only begun. The following morning broke gray and reluctant, as if the sun itself were weary of shining over the ruin that stood at the edge of the village. Alexander rose stiffly from his couch, his body aching from the chill and the weight of restless dreams. He had not slept deeply. The night had been filled with whispers he could not quite hear, and footsteps that seemed to echo from places the school no longer possessed. Each time he had stirred, the memory of the hidden chamber below returned to him, vivid and heavy, pulling him back toward the darkness beneath the floorboards. He could not stay away. He ate a meager breakfast, bread gone hard and a cup of water drawn from the pump outside, before descending again into the basement. The lantern he carried trembled in his hand, casting quivering shadows across the damp stone walls. The cold air of the underground rose to meet him as he stepped carefully down the stairs, and the silence thickened with every pace. He passed the crates he had opened before and returned to the wall where he had broken through. The hole gaped like a wound, its edges jagged, the stones displaced and scattered on the floor. He crouched to pass through, his shoulders scraping the narrow opening, and entered once again the chamber where dust and memory clung to every surface. He set the lantern on the table, its light spilling across the small relics left behind. The wooden doll, the deflated ball, the folded clothing, the notebooks that bore the children's words. He touched them gently, his fingertips brushing over the cracked surfaces as though they might dissolve under his hand. The room seemed heavier now, as though the objects themselves had grown aware of his presence. He whispered into the silence, promising that he had not come to take but to remember. His voice was rough in the stillness, and he thought he heard, just for an instant, a faint sigh in answer. It was then that he noticed something in the corner, half buried beneath a rotted canvas sheet. The fabric crumbled at his touch, disintegrating into damp fragments that scattered across the floor. Beneath it lay a shape, rectangular and massive, its outline unmistakable. His breath caught. He pulled back the rest of the covering to reveal a chest of iron, its surface streaked with rust, its hinges corroded by years of damp. A thick lock, its metal blackened with time, clung stubbornly to the latch. Alexander leaned closer, running his hand across the cold surface. The chest was heavy, solid, unyielding. Unlike the fragile relics that surrounded it, this had been built to endure. He felt a shiver of anticipation as he studied it, a sense that whatever lay inside was not meant for casual discovery. His pulse quickened, not from fear but from the weight of possibility. He looked around the chamber, then back at the chest, and knew he could not leave it unopened. He searched the basement for something he could use to pry it open. Near the crates he had found earlier, an old sledgehammer leaned forgotten against the wall. Its handle was cracked, but still firm. He lifted it with both hands, grunting at the strain on his arms, and carried it back into the chamber. The lantern's glow flickered across the iron surface as he raised the hammer and brought it down upon the lock. The clang rang through the room, sharp and violent, and dust rained from the beams above. The lock resisted, but he struck again and again, each blow reverberating through his bones. At last, with a shriek of tearing metal, the lock snapped free and clattered to the floor. His hands trembled as he pulled the latch and lifted the lid. The hinges groaned, stiff from disuse, before yielding to his effort. The chest opened slowly, exhaling a stale breath of air that carried with it the scent of age and secrecy. He lowered the lantern and peered inside. What he saw stole his breath. Bundles of cloth lay neatly arranged, their colors faded, but their shapes preserved. He unwrapped the first and found a necklace of gold, its chain delicate, its pendant set with a small jewel that caught the lantern light even through a film of dust. Beneath it were rings, brooches, and bracelets, each crafted with care, each bearing the mark of families who had once treasured them. He set them aside reverently and reached deeper. There were books bound in cracked leather, their titles pressed into the covers in fading gilt. He opened one and found pages of records, carefully written in ink that had barely faded. Property deeds, names, dates, documents that spoke of ownership, of inheritance, of wealth that had been meant to pass from one generation to the next. He turned the pages slowly, his throat tight. These were not treasures gathered by thieves. They were the possessions of families who had hidden them here in the hope that they might one day return. The jewelry had been worn by mothers and daughters. The deeds had belonged to fathers and grandfathers. The chest was not a hoard. It was a trust. As he explored further, he found more. Coins of gold and silver stacked in small pouches, their surfaces dulled by time but still gleaming faintly. A silver watch, its hands frozen, its face cracked. Letters tied with ribbon, the ink blurred but still legible in parts. Words of love, of farewell, of hope for reunion. He held them carefully, afraid they might crumble, and felt the weight of voices long silenced pressing into his chest. For a long time he knelt there, the open chest before him, the lantern casting its glow over the artifacts of lives interrupted. He felt no thrill of discovery, no triumph at the thought of riches. Instead, a profound sorrow settled over him, heavier than any treasure could weigh. These things had been hidden not to be found by strangers, but to be safeguarded until their owners could reclaim them. Yet no one had returned. The chest had waited in silence, guarding memories that had outlasted those who had entrusted them. Alexander sat back on his heels, his hands trembling, and covered his face. He had come here a broken man, seeking only to fill the emptiness of his days with work. But now he understood that the school had chosen him for more than labor. It had placed in his hands the remnants of lives, the silent plea of those who had once lived and dreamed within its walls. He could not walk away. He closed the chest carefully, though the broken lock dangled uselessly. He draped the remnants of the canvas over it once more, though it could not truly conceal what had been uncovered. He lifted the lantern and looked around the chamber again. The toys, the clothing, the notebooks. All these were part of the same story, a story of children hidden away, of families who had trusted these walls to protect what was dearest to them. Now the story had passed into his keeping. When he returned to the upper floor, his steps were heavier than before. The diaries on the desk, the dust-covered classrooms, the silent corridors all seemed to watch him more closely now, as though aware of what he carried within him. He sat in the library, the lantern flickering beside him, and spread the documents from the chest across the desk. Names, dates, properties, signatures. He read them carefully, one by one, his lips moving silently as though reciting prayers. These were not strangers. These were voices, waiting to be remembered. Night fell as he worked, but he did not light another lamp. He let the darkness close in, broken only by the faint glow of the lantern, and continued to read. When at last exhaustion forced him to stop, he leaned back and stared at the ceiling. The silence of the school was deep, but it no longer felt indifferent. It felt aware, as though it acknowledged what he had done. He had opened the chest. He had seen what it had protected, and now, whether he wanted it or not, the responsibility was his. Alexander closed his eyes, the ache of his body forgotten for the moment. He thought of the villagers who had laughed, of the clerk who had sneered, of the life he had left behind. None of them mattered now. What mattered were the names on the documents, the jewelry wrapped in cloth, the letters bound with ribbon. What mattered was the trust that had been placed in the school, and through some strange twist of fate, in him. As sleep claimed him at last, he dreamed not of war or of loss, but of children's voices, faint but insistent, calling to him from the shadows. They were not cries of fear this time, but whispers of expectation. They had been waiting, and now he had found the key to their silence. The chest had opened not only its contents but the path to the truth. And Alexander, weary though he was, felt the stirrings of a resolve he had not known in years. The night after Alexander forced open the iron chest was unlike the others he had spent in the ruined school. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a kind of tension, as though the building itself knew that its deepest secret had been disturbed. He had left the chest covered again in the hidden chamber below, but the weight of what he had seen remained with him. Even when he closed his eyes, he could still picture the glint of gold beneath the lantern's glow, the faded ink of property deeds, the trembling script of letters written in haste. He heard the faint echo of children's voices in his dreams, not cries this time, but whispers, urging him to continue. By morning, when he sat once more at the desk in the library, spreading the papers before him, he felt the certainty that he was not simply a curious man poking through ruins. He had become the custodian of a story long silenced. The diaries were his starting point. He opened the first he had found in the hidden chamber, turning the fragile pages slowly, his fingers brushing across the uneven handwriting. The words revealed nights spent huddled in darkness, meals rationed until nothing remained, instructions from a teacher to remain quiet no matter what happened above. Each entry was brief, almost clipped, as though the children had written in haste, fearful of discovery. When he reached the last page, blank except for a smear of ink, he sat for a long moment staring at the emptiness. He reached for another. That one told of hope that parents would return, that soldiers might leave, that the war would pass and life would resume. But the ending was the same, abrupt, unfinished, silent. He spread several diaries across the table, comparing the words, piecing them together as though they were fragments of a larger puzzle. A pattern began to emerge. The school had been turned into a place of refuge, perhaps secretly, perhaps with the knowledge of only a few. The children had been brought here, hidden away with their belongings, their notebooks serving as the only outlet for their voices. Families must have believed this place safe, safe enough to leave their most precious treasures in the iron chest, safe enough to entrust their children to its walls. And yet no safety had come. The silence that followed was proof enough. As he read the letters from the chest, his understanding deepened. Many were addressed to loved ones, written in careful script that trembled at the edges. "If I cannot return, let these words reach you one day," one began. Another spoke of trust. "We leave what we cannot carry, keep it safe until we return." Some bore the marks of hurried writing, lines that broke off mid-thought, others the stains of water or tears. Alexander read them with his lips moving silently, as though reciting prayers for the dead. These were not only mementos, they were last testaments, entrusted to the hidden chamber in hope that they would survive, even if their writers did not. The documents told another story, one of wealth and inheritance interrupted. Property deeds bore signatures that matched the names in the children's diaries. Bank records showed savings carefully set aside, intended for futures that had never arrived. He traced his finger along the lines of ink, imagining the hands that had signed them, the determination of people who believed in tomorrow, even as war threatened to erase everything. They had entrusted their future to this school, believing it could outlast the storm. Alexander's mind turned to the villagers who had laughed when he purchased the ruin, the clerk who had smirked at his folly. Did they know? Had whispers of this truth been carried quietly through generations, buried beneath ridicule and indifference? Or had the story been lost entirely, smothered by fear and silence, until it became no more than an empty building at the edge of the village? He wondered if the laughter had not been born of ignorance, but of denial, an attempt to forget what had once taken place within these walls. The longer he studied the diaries and documents, the clearer his vision became. He saw the school as it must once have been, children seated at desks by day, writing lessons in neat rows, laughter filling the hallways. And then he saw the change. The same halls filled not with learning, but with whispers and fear. The basement crowded with small bodies pressed together in the dark, waiting for footsteps to pass overhead. He imagined the night the silence fell completely, when the diaries were abandoned mid-sentence, when the toys were left on the shelves, when the chest was closed for the last time. He felt the weight of that night pressing through the years until it landed squarely on his shoulders. At times he pushed back from the desk, his breath unsteady, his body trembling with exhaustion. The school seemed to close in around him, its silence no longer passive but insistent, as if urging him onward. He returned to the hidden chamber several times, lantern in hand, staring at the chest and the relics it held. Each time he felt the same pressure in his chest, the same awareness that this was more than discovery. It was inheritance. Not of wealth, not of property, but of duty. He thought of his own life, of the years wasted in bitterness after the war had taken his strength, his family, his place in the world. He had thought himself forgotten, cast aside. Now he realized that the school too had been forgotten, its true story buried beneath vines and dust. And just as he had survived in silence, so had it. Perhaps that was why he had been drawn here, why the notice in the newspaper had clung to him. He was meant to listen, to uncover, to restore. The sun dipped low outside, casting the library in dim light that turned the papers on the desk into shadows. Alexander leaned back, rubbing his eyes, his body aching from hours bent over the relics of the past. He thought he heard the faint echo of footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. He held his breath, listening, but the sound faded into silence. He told himself it was the settling of the building, yet deep down he knew the truth. The school was not empty. It was alive with memory, with presence, with voices that lingered in the corners of every room. That night he lay awake again, the diaries stacked neatly beside him, the letters folded carefully back into the chest. The silence was heavy, yet it no longer felt hostile. It was watchful, as though the school itself recognized him now as its keeper. He closed his eyes and whispered a promise into the dark. He would not let these voices fade. He would carry them, restore them, give them back to the world that had forgotten. Only then, he felt, would the school's burden be lifted. For the first time in years, he felt a purpose greater than his own survival. He was no longer just a broken man filling his days with meaningless labor. He was the custodian of memory, the inheritor of trust, the one chosen to speak for those who could not. And as sleep finally claimed him, he dreamed of light flooding through the school's broken windows, of laughter returning to its halls, of children's voices rising once more, not in fear, but in joy. When he woke at dawn, the decision was already made. He would not sell the school as the clerk had suggested. He would not abandon the relics to dust. He would rebuild, restore, and remember. The truth of the past had been laid in his hands, and he would not let it be lost again. The morning after Alexander resolved that he would not let the school's secrets fall back into silence carried with it a brightness he had not felt in years. The sky was still gray, the air damp as always, yet he rose from his makeshift bed with a steadiness that surprised him. His body remained heavy with pain, his legs stiff and uncooperative, but the weight that had pressed on his chest for so long felt lighter. The school's silence no longer mocked him as it had on that first day. It surrounded him now like an expectant companion, waiting to see what he would do with the knowledge he carried. He spent the early hours back in the library, carefully arranging the documents and letters from the iron chest. He stacked the diaries neatly, lined up the property deeds, smoothed the folded letters, and laid out the jewelry as though preparing an exhibit. The cracked desk that had once borne only dust now bore lives, memories, and promises that had survived beyond those who had made them. As he looked at them, he thought not of riches, but of duty. These things were not his to keep, but his to protect until he could find where they belonged. Yet he knew that his task was larger than sorting papers. The school itself demanded attention. It had endured years of neglect, its walls scarred, its roof sagging, its classrooms left to rot. He had seen the way the villagers sneered when he rolled through the cafe, the clerks smirk when handing him the deed. To them, the school was nothing more than a ruin. If he was to honor the voices that still lingered within its walls, he would need to restore it. He would need to breathe life back into the building so that its silence could become memory rather than despair. The first days of his decision were spent with simple labor. He cleared the weeds that choked the yard, his cane sinking into the damp earth as he bent to pull the stubborn roots free. Each swing of his rusted spade was clumsy, his muscles untrained for such work after years of idleness, but he forced himself to continue. Sweat soaked his shirt, his breath came harsh, and yet with every patch of ground he cleared, he felt something within him strengthen. The laughter of the villagers still echoed faintly in his memory, but he let it drive him now rather than wound him. Let them mock, he thought. Soon they would see. When the roof leaked again during a heavy rain, he climbed the ladder despite the protest of his leg and patched what he could with sheets of metal scavenged from the shed. The work was dangerous, each movement sending pain through his body, yet he pressed on. The school had survived storms greater than his fatigue. So would he. By the time the clouds cleared, water no longer poured through the cracks, and he sat beneath the patched roof with a sense of triumph he had not felt since before the war. Word of his labor spread, just as word of his purchase had spread. Villagers came to stand at the fence, watching him struggle with tools, their expressions shifting from amusement to curiosity. A few offered jeers, but fewer than before. Some asked why he bothered. He offered no explanation, only a steady glance, and returned to his work. In time, the laughter quieted. The ruin they had dismissed was stirring back to life, and though they did not yet understand why, they began to watch more closely. It was not long before he realized he could not do it all alone. The school was too large, its wounds too deep. With the documents from the chest as proof, he approached the authorities in town. At first they dismissed him, the same clerk rolling his eyes, certain the veteran had lost his senses. But when Alexander laid the deeds on the table, when he showed the signatures and names preserved for decades, the tone shifted. The papers were undeniable. These were not the ramblings of a broken man, but evidence of history, of trust safeguarded through the years. Officials grew wary, then respectful. A promise of funds for preservation was made, though slow to arrive, and word spread that the old school was not merely a ruin, but a monument. Workers began to arrive, hesitant at first, then steadily. They patched the roof properly, replaced the broken windows, scrubbed the grime from the floors. Each hammer's strike, each board set in place, felt to Alexander like a heartbeat returning to a body thought dead. He oversaw it all from the library, his cane beside him, the diaries and letters never far from his reach. He guided them where he could, insisting that certain rooms remain untouched, that the relics remain preserved. He told them the school was not being rebuilt merely to stand, but to speak. As weeks turned to months, the transformation was visible. The yard cleared of weeds, the playground restored, the walls painted anew. Yet Alexander knew it was not the fresh paint or the mended roof that mattered most. It was the memory. He prepared rooms as memorials, placing the diaries beneath glass, the letters arranged with care, the jewelry and belongings displayed not as treasure, but as testimony. He set the children's drawings on the walls, their crooked lines and faded colors preserved as though they had only just been pinned there. The sealed chamber below remained closed to all but him, a place of reverence too sacred for careless eyes. Visitors began to come, at first only villagers, curious to see what had driven the veteran to toil in silence for so long. Then others from nearby towns, drawn by whispers of a discovery hidden beneath dust and stone. They walked the halls, gazed at the exhibits, and many left in silence, their faces solemn. Some wept openly, others bowed their heads as though standing in a church. Alexander watched them quietly, his heart heavy yet proud. The school had begun to speak again, and the world was finally listening. The man who had once been mocked, dismissed as a broken shell of a soldier, was now seen differently. Children who had once avoided his eyes greeted him when he passed. Adults who had whispered about his folly now offered nods of respect. Even those who had laughed loudest grew quiet in his presence, their faces shadowed with something like shame. He had not sought their approval, but he accepted their change in silence. His purpose was not for them. It was for the children who had written in the diaries, for the families who had hidden their treasures in trust, for the voices that had been silenced. On an evening as the sun set, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, Alexander sat in the restored library, his cane resting at his side. The windows once broken now shone clear, and the walls gleamed with fresh paint. Yet he had left one section untouched, the place where the strange markings had been carved into the wood. They remained visible, preserved as part of the story. He looked around the room, at the shelves filled once more with books, at the desk where the documents lay in neat order, and felt a peace he had never expected to know again. The school was alive. It was no longer a ruin filled with whispers of despair. It was a house of memory, of testimony, of life. He could hear it in the footsteps of visitors, in the quiet sobs of those who lingered too long before a child's notebook, in the soft voices of children who now played again in the yard. The silence had been transformed into something different, something enduring. For Alexander himself, the change was no less profound. He remained a man with a broken body, his legs stiff, his movements slow, his nights restless. But he was no longer defined by loss. The war had taken much, but it had not taken his capacity to serve, to honor, to give voice to those who could no longer speak. In restoring the school, he had restored himself. The bitterness that had once filled him had given way to something gentler, quieter but stronger, a sense of purpose that no one could strip away. That night, as the last light faded and the halls of the school settled into quiet once more, Alexander sat by the window and gazed across the yard. He thought of the children who had once written in their diaries by candlelight, of the families who had entrusted their treasures to the chest, of the silence that had lingered for decades. He whispered into the darkness, a simple vow, that their memory would never again be forgotten. The wind stirred the leaves outside, and in the stillness of the library, he thought he heard the faint echo of voices, not fearful now, but calm, whispering a single word: home. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in many years, he felt at peace. Don't let this be the last story you discover. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss the next jaw-dropping twist. There are even more unbelievable true-style stories waiting for you. And the next one might shock you even more than this. Click to watch the next video on your screen and dive deeper into the mysteries we've uncovered. And if this story made your heart race, share it with your friends and family. Let them feel the same chills you just did. The journey doesn't end here. It's only getting started.